had the reserved list.
Yeah, it's so funny. I actually like pulled it up today and I forgot to download it. Sorry, give me 1 second and then I'll be ready. My apologies. There it is right there.
Okay, and we are going live now. I'm just waiting for it to show up here. And we are live, so Diana, you should see it on there now. And make sure you mute the YouTube link as well. So.
And I'll start at 5, my friends. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Wes McNeese. I'm Executive Director for Diversity Initiatives, Southern Illinois University. This evening's conversation of understanding will address intersectional discrimination with an emphasis on race, gender, disability, LGBTQIA. This will be a 2-hour virtual discussion sponsored by the SIU System President's Office and the System's Diversity Advisory Council. It is being broadcast on YouTube. By the way, would you please subscribe to our SIU System YouTube channel by clicking the red subscribe button and then the notification bell icon so you will be notified when our next video is uploaded to our website. This evening, we brought together a group of well-informed leaders to discuss tonight's topic. Lindy Wagner, the director of SIU Edwardsville's Student Center for Diversity and Inclusion, will moderate this discussion and introduce our speakers. Diana McGrean will monitor audience questions. Carol Walker is our Zoom coordinator, and Dr. Dan Mahoney, the SIU president, will be making closing comments. Ms. Wagner, please lead us through.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNeese. I'm truly grateful to be here as part of this conversation of understanding today. And thank you again for the panelists who we'll hear from shortly, Carol for handling our Zoom needs, and thank you, Diana, for monitoring the questions. I would encourage all of you to comment and interact with the panelists via the chat in our YouTube channel. And any questions you pose will be shared with us during the conversation. And I would also encourage you to let us know if your question is intended for a specific panelist. As Dr. McNeese mentioned, our topic today is intersectional discrimination, race, disability, gender, LGBTQIA, and our conversation will focus on those intersectional discriminations. Our panelists will describe experiences and how to address bias in the SIU community. Additionally, with increased violence around the country targeting individuals of Asian descent, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, the program will also address these attacks, their impact, and how to be an ally for this community and others. In the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or DEI work, there are terms we hear often. One of those is intersectionality. Many attribute this work to Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer, civil rights advocate, and leading scholar of critical race theory. While others may have been doing intersectional work, Crenshaw deeply explored this idea in an article, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color, in the Stanford Law Review, which was based on her address at the Third National Conference on Women of Color and Law in 1990. She discussed that, quote, feminist efforts to politicize experiences of women and anti-racist efforts to politicize experiences of people of color have frequently proceeded as though the issues and experiences they each detail occur on mutually exclusive terrains, end quote. She highlights that these identity categories are made by cultural representations, laws, and assumptions. I would say these identity categories are created, they are constructed, and they continue because we are socialized to not only believe them, but in our daily practices, we're encouraged to reify them. This is key to consider. Dr. Ibram Kendi noted, who is a well-known anti-racism scholar, that all identity groups are a collection of intersectional identities. He gives the example that all racial groups are truly a collection of intersectional identities that can be differentiated by gender, sexuality, class, ethnicity, skin color, nationality, culture, language, and so much more. The consistent dilemma of this recognition of intersectional identities, which can make it difficult to critically engage with one another, is power. Twofold, as Crenshaw would highlight. The first manifestation of this power is the actual process of creating these categories. I would say we often see this in a binary: black, white, woman, man, feminine, masculine, poor, rich, and the list can go on. Often we see these in a way that push us to each find some way of aligning with this binary. Crenshaw highlights then the second act of this power is politicizing these, so that our identities not only gain meaning, but they gain additional power by how they're created and how they're expressed. This ability to create an intersection can create sites of resistance, which I want to come back to shortly. But these intersections and attribution of power can also create what some have named the oppression Olympics, or the idea that oppression or marginalization is a competition to delineate who is the most oppressed. This term, coined by feminist scholars in the same time period as Crenshaw's work, has been attributed to Chicana feminist Elizabeth Martinez in a conversation with Angela Davis in 1993. And here is where it may get more complicated. We must be careful in recognizing intersectionality so as to not get caught up in the oppression Olympics or playing identity cards as trumping another identity card as if oppression is a game. It isn't. What we need to recognize is intersectional discrimination, or when our intersectional identities simultaneously occur, interact, and shape our experiences in an inseparable way. This intersection creates unique forms of discrimination. Dr. Kendi notes in his work that to be anti-racist, one must also recognize the intersections where race lives. One must recognize class racism, or how classes are racialized and how policies support this racial classification and justify those policies with racist ideas, or that one must recognize queer racism or gender racism for those same reasons. These intersections of identity create the unique intersectional discrimination that we are here to discuss today. And recognizing intersectional identities and intersectional discrimination is a step in our own education and making changes in the structures that create the identities in the first place. This brings me back to Crenshaw, highlighting that intersections are also a site of resistance. She notes that one must first be aware of those intersectional identities. And Kendi notes a specific intersectional discrimination that I want to talk a little bit about, space racism, which he defines as a collection of racist policies that lead to resource inequity between racialized spaces or even elimination of certain racialized spaces. These actions are substantiated then by those racist ideas about the spaces. And I want to share an example of this before we pass on to our colleagues. So at this point in my life, I've attended and worked at a variety of institutions: public, private, large, small, mid-size, name brand, you name it. I have probably been to a version of one of those. One specific area where I've noticed this kind of space racism and intersectional discrimination is for student organizations or programming for students with minoritized identities. At one specific predominantly white institution, or PWI, the historically white fraternities and sororities had a suite of spaces with computers, lounge chairs, and couches, desks for officers, and a conference room for meetings, while the historically Black fraternities and sororities had a room with a computer and a desk and a couch. This space was also always packed and was considered a Black space on campus. And because there were always students there, and because it was a space the Black students wanted to congregate, they wanted to ask for more space. When the historically Black fraternities and sororities asked for more physical space, they were told that based on the numbers of their active members, this is a space that would be fair. I could certainly go into more details about this experience for the students, but I want to highlight this, that at a PWI that was over 80% white, at what time would there have been justification for more space for the historically Black fraternities and sororities? The answer is there wouldn't if the policies and decisions were based solely on numbers. This resource distribution, while seemingly fair, would never be equitable in providing the historically Black fraternities and sororities with the space that they needed to exist in a safe and comfortable way. This is space racism, a unique discrimination based on race and space. This is just one example. I've also seen the ways that intersectional discrimination has manifested in different ways, in the ways that the very types of office that I sit in and are part of and proud of can also be exclusionary. When I first was an undergraduate student trying to find my way, there was no space for BIPOC students in the way I see it now, and certainly not for someone like me who's multiracial. But there is still room to grow, as I've seen places with multiple identity centers also see and recognize their failure sometimes to consider these intersections. For example, when a queer Afro-Latina cisgender woman doesn't quite feel she belongs in the Black space because of her Latina heritage, and doesn't quite feel she belongs in the queer space that feels strongly white and male. It is at these intersections that we must critically think, and where we can possibly make the changes. It is for reasons like this that centers such as the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion on the SIUE campus exist. And thankfully, to the Black students and staff who advocated for this space, this office exists to bring programming and education to the campus about these varieties of identities. And while it's not perfect, and there are still times that intersectional discrimination does rear its ugly head, there will at least be conversations like these, and students, faculty, and staff like the ones who helped create the center in which I now work to keep critical conversations like these going. So before hearing our panelists, I want to end with one thought: that while identity categories and intersectional discrimination are inherently steeped in power, socialization, policies, and institutions, we can, with an intersectional lens about these identities, bring attention to changes that need to be made to make our campuses and other institutions in our lives more equitable. While it may be desired for us to destroy the identity categories that are forever placing us where we may not wish to be placed, perhaps we can also reimagine these categories as welcome sites of resistance first, sites where we work together to break the categories. Perhaps recognizing intersectional identities and intersectional discrimination is an opportunity to deeply understand one another, to truly understand the complexities within each of us in an effort to build coalitions and alliances and see beyond the essentializing of our own single identities. So I challenge all of you listening to think as you hear from our panelists about your own intersections of identities and how those can be sites of resistance for change. And with that, I'm super pleased to announce our first panelist, who is Dr. Anthony Cheeseboro, an associate professor of history at Southern Illinois Edwardsville. Dr. Cheeseboro.
Hi, Ms. Wagner. I really appreciate you giving me that nice introduction. It makes me feel awfully smart here today. And I would like to just talk about intersectionality within a historical context, since I am a historian by training, and that intersectionality is definitely going to go down in intellectual history. It's an important concept. And it's an important concept because it's a concept that allows us to understand and make order of the world that we're in. Now, as Ms. Wagner mentioned earlier, the term intersectionality was first coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. Somebody who's actually, still very active. I think she's, in her very early 60s. And so, she's somebody who's still a vital academic force. As a matter of fact, I heard her on National Public Radio yesterday morning. Now, the thing about great ideas is that great ideas are developed by specific people to explain specific things. But great ideas and great concepts are great because they can be co-opted, they can be transformed, and they can be used by other people to explain things beyond their original meaning. And I was reading an article today that was published in Vox by Joan Coxon, and she mentioned how the term intersectionality was a concept that Dr. Crenshaw first came up with. In particular, she was looking at cases of African-American women who were suing General Motors and other corporations for discrimination, and only to have their cases dismissed because judges would argue that, you can't ask for a special category for being Black and women. I mean, basically, the judge would argue that, you should either ask for relief as a woman or a Black person. You're not entitled to have both categories. And so, but the fact of the matter is that Dr. Crenshaw came up with this way of understanding things, and it applied to a lot of people. And so what we see is, going back about 4 years or so ago, the term intersectionality started being used a lot more often by feminist activists. And over time, it has become a much more common term, something used to explain a lot of things. And one of the interesting things about it is that people who view themselves as conservative, people who quite often see themselves as oppositional to people who are pushing for social change, have also become aware of the term intersectionality and have used it, quite often as kind of a way to belittle the notion of diversity, saying that, if you accept intersectionality, then all of a sudden you have a competition between people over who's the most oppressed. And the reverse of this, of course, is that some people, given their status in society, are the least oppressed and are least entitled to any consideration. I would argue that way of understanding intersectionality does it serious injustice and really fails to understand the utility of the concept, because intersectionality is a concept that at one level can complicate things, because it can show that all of us are not simply one person. All of us have more than one identity. But the flip side of that is that if we recognize that we have multiple identities, if we recognize that we are affected by the world in a multitude of different ways, intersectionality becomes a method by which we can truly appreciate the individuality of all of us, the fact that we all are not merely categories. And to me, that's the real beauty of intersectionality. Now, in kind of a weird way, I'm going to give you guys, give the audience a couple of really unpleasant examples that show how intersectionality can really demonstrate how people are really affected by a number of different categories. And, even people that we might see as being privileged and in the greater scheme of things, quite often feel themselves at a serious disadvantage. Now, I'm sure we all are familiar with the mass killings that have occurred within the last few weeks. First, the one that happened in Georgia, where a young man, a 21-year-old man, allegedly attacked a number of massage parlors. And the rationale that he gave was that he had a sex addiction. It also came out that he has a fundamentalist Christian background. And he lashed out against these massage parlors because he saw them as, I guess kind of a locus or kind of a center of his temptation. He felt that by destroying these things, he was destroying objects of his temptation. Now, a week later, a young man who's also 21 years old went into a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado, and killed 10 people. Now, it comes out, we come to find out that this young man is the family of Syrian immigrants, and that he is a young man who was known to have a short temper, somebody who really didn't fit in well. Now, the bottom line is that in both cases, we have young men, young men who phenotypically look white. Now, I say phenotypically look white because, quite often in American culture, we don't necessarily perceive people of Middle Eastern background as white, and which, goes to show you how often, race is as much a cultural construct as it is a morphological or phenotypical construct, because a huge percentage of people in the Mideast, if they wear Western style clothes and, simply don't talk, you wouldn't recognize them from somebody of European background. This young man in particular could easily pass for somebody of European background. But the bottom line is that you have two 21-year-old men, two 21-year-old white men who are socially awkward. And by the standards of society, neither one of them is particularly attractive. And in both cases, it appears that both young men had issues with social acceptance. Both of them had issues in terms of dealing with women. And so what we see here is that as young white men, people on the outside looking in might look at them and say, well, these are people who should be at the top of the social ladder. Obviously, they didn't see themselves this way, but because probably, I'm not a psychologist and I don't know their cases, but I think there's good reason to suspect that because of who they were, they probably felt entitled to be in a better position than they were, and they ended up lashing out with violence. Now, this is important because if we recognize the issues that people have to deal with, then perhaps we can allow people to interact in a more positive way, and we can kind of help people come to terms with who they are. And so therefore, I think that there are some basic guidelines in terms of intersectionality that we should all think about. And these are pretty basic. I say, first of all, we have to learn to see people. Now, when I say learn to see people, we have to actually learn to look at people, observe people, talk to people. And when people talk back to us, we need to actually learn to listen. Because, quite often one of the most difficult skills to acquire is to actually listen to people uncritically, or at least listen to people without feeling a need to rebut things either openly or internally. Now, the other thing that I think people have to understand in terms of dealing with intersectionality is just simply accept that different people have different challenges. We all don't have the same challenges. The challenges that I had as a young Black man were not the challenges that either one of those young men who got in trouble had. They weren't the exact same issues. Now, some issues would have been similar because we both, when I was a 21-year-old man, I had some of the issues they dealt with, but as somebody who's obviously Black, that brought me another set of challenges. Now, the other thing that I think is really important and really is at the heart of the frivolousness of some of the conservative critiques of intersectionality is that avoid comparing your struggles to someone else's struggles. And This goes back to what I mentioned in terms of my principle number 2, is that if you accept that people have different challenges, then you understand that because their issues are different, it doesn't mean they are easier than yours or harder than yours, but they're different and they need to be understood within the context of what that person is going through. Now, 4 is understand that people often succeed despite discrimination. Success is not proof of acceptance on its own. In other words, people who are driven, people who work hard, people who are very gifted, people who happen to maybe catch a break or two, may have great success despite the limitations that they are dealt with. I mean, if you look at a historical successful business person like, say, a Berry Gordy, who became a multimillionaire in the 60s because of Motown, his success does not mean that as a young Black man in Detroit, he did not face racism. It didn't mean that he probably didn't have issues in terms of gaining access to capital. It just simply meant that he saw an opportunity. He was in a position to take advantage of it, and he became very successful. And this is something that I think is important, because I think often people look at success and then they argue that race is not an issue, or that gender discrimination is not an issue. And then for number 5, I would like to say that related to all these other issues of intersectionality, that in terms of dealing with people, one of the basic courtesies that we can give people is to, once again, go back to the whole notion of listening to people. And when people tell you that terms are offensive, that they don't like a particular term, if they don't like the way they're addressed, they don't like the name that they're given, respect people. Don't say it. Find another way to express what you want to say. The worst thing that we can possibly say is that, well, I didn't mean it that way, because what you meant is not the issue. It's how people accept it. You know, I can speak on my experience as a man dealing with women. When I was a younger man, I certainly said things or did things that my female peers did not appreciate. And, you know, my response quite often was, oh, I didn't mean it that way. But, you know, ultimately, as I got older, I just realized that, you know, what I meant was not the issue. I need to actually listen to them and modify my language, modify my behavior in a way that's not offensive, that is not seen as sexist or oppressive or anything negative. And so to wrap things up, I say that intersectionality is a challenge for us because it makes us look at the world in a more complicated way. But if we are willing to make the effort to try to understand the people around us and their complexity, it can allow us to really appreciate the people we know in a more full way. And it can allow us to be better people and to be better allies. I know that's kind of a buzzword nowadays, but if we really understand intersectionality, we can be allies in the truest sense of the word. And I would argue the truest sense of being an ally is fundamentally being decent and finding ways to express decency to everybody. And so that's pretty much what I have to say at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheeseboro, for those comments. I actually mostly appreciated this learn to listen, right? Because I do think this is the one skill that in the US context, a lot of people struggle with, right? We're quick to answer before we listen. So I really think that that's something that's going to sit with me. So thank you for that. And also trying to truly understand people. Thank you. With that, our next panelist to share with us today is Dr. Christine Todd, who serves as the chair of the Medical Humanities Program at the SIU School of Medicine, and also serves as the chief wellness advocate for the Center for Human and Organizational Potential. So Dr. Todd, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I want to talk a little bit about the intersection of gender and race So right now we have the medical humanities clerkship going on. So I've got all the third year medical students together to talk about subjects in medical humanities. And today we spent the whole day talking about women. So I'm gonna spend my evening talking about women and the intersection with race as well. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I feel like I have quite a bit of lived experience in this realm as a woman who is biracial. My mother is a Japanese immigrant, and I'm one of those people that when folks walk on the elevator with me, they very persistently say, "Where are you from?" And on a good day, I appreciate the fact that people are curious. And of course, I'm proud of my ancestry, both my Scotch-Irish ancestry and my Japanese ancestry. But on some days I say, well, I'm originally from the Chicago suburbs. Where are you from? To which I often get the response, oh, I'm an American, as if I wasn't. And so when you go through a lifetime of answering that question and feeling that vibe, I think you spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection of race and gender and being an American, for sure. So I want to start by talking about gender for just a second, by talking about the difference between sexism and misogyny. Up until quite recently, I saw these as pretty much synonymous words. But it was through reading the writings of Katie Mann, who is a philosopher, that I began to realize that no, these are different things. And I actually find the distinction incredibly useful. So sexism is rooted in the idea that there are physiological and biological differences between the sexes. And that's why there are sort of different treatments for men and women. So a sexist argument might go like this: we shouldn't have women in the army because they're not strong enough to fight in the military. While it is true that women have less muscle mass and aren't in general as strong as men tend to be, you could actually imagine having a discussion with somebody who says this and say, you know, in the modern army, physical brute strength is not of the same importance as it used to be. So in modern warfare, with modern warfare technology, maybe you should rethink that. Maybe more women should be able to serve, because the argument is rooted in biology and physiology. There is some rationality at work there. Misogyny is a completely different thing. Misogyny is the idea that women need to be watched and policed and kept within boundaries so that they don't upset the status quo. So a misogynist argument is women should not be allowed into med school because we need to reserve those places for men who are the breadwinners in their family. So in order to preserve the status quo of men being in charge of the economic resources, we need to police women and police them out of being admitted into medical school. It is much harder to have a discussion with somebody who's coming from a misogynist perspective, because it isn't really rooted in a very rational thought, but it's rooted in sort of who gets to control the power and the resources kind of thinking. Another way of thinking about this is that sexist ideas kind of support gender discrimination, but misogynist ideas enforce gender discrimination and keep them going as the systems that work and continue to disadvantage women. And you can apply very similar concepts to the way that Blacks are discriminated from with whites, and ignorant opinions versus extremely racist opinions. One is supporting the system, the other enforces the system. And so I find that incredibly helpful when I think about some of the ways in which gender is definitely a source of disparity and discrimination in our world. So just a bit about gender harassment. You know, we often think about that in the lines of sexual harassment, quid pro quo that's inappropriate about sexual favors, comments like, who did you sleep with to get that job? A comment I have received, stuff like that. But I think much more impactful is the persistent gender harassment that takes the form of women being persistently paid less than men for equivalent work units, especially when you consider women's place in families, directing resources for families, and doing a lot of the unpaid work that it takes to make our society go. That gender gap and that gender form of gender harassment that is the pay gap gets more and more egregious the more you think about where women stand in society. So now I'd like to turn a little bit to the intersection of gender and race. When you look at all the different forms of gendered harassment, it is always worse when you look at groups broken out into race. So white women experience a lot less of gendered harassment than Black women do. So there is sort of a doubling down of the devaluement that's happening with individuals when you have that intersection of gender and race. And I would cite as one of the most striking examples of how race intersects with being a woman as looking at how white women tend to vote and how Black women tend to vote. The difference between those two groups is race. A lot of people say, oh, women are going to vote for that. Women are going to, what kind of women are you talking about? Because the way white women vote has some markers of some really extreme misogyny. White women acting to enforce the status quo, partially because it's working for them. Black women tend to vote more in the lines of changing policies, changing governmental approaches to things. Couldn't be two very different groups of voters. So you can talk about women, the women's vote, but when you intersect that with race, you can really see that they're quite divided, and you could make an argument that that part of that division has to do with the misogyny that's operating in our society. And so lastly, I want to come to what's been happening lately. And what I mean by what's been happening lately is two things that I would like to mention. One is a very controversial article that was published in a journal of economics a couple months ago, in which a white male Harvard researcher, Harvard law professor, wrote a study in which he looked at the case of Korean comfort women. These were girls and women who during World War II were basically kidnapped and human trafficked by Japanese men in the military to be sex workers. There has been a lot of grit and conflict ever since the war about reparations, acknowledgement, apologies about the way these Korean comfort women were treated by the Japanese, and the lack of the Japanese government in acknowledging that really this war crime had happened to these Korean girls and women. Well, this Harvard researcher basically wrote a paper in which he said, well, if you consider game theory and apply it to this, you actually can make the case that this was a consensual relationship. And not only was this written, but it was peer-reviewed by an editorial staff completely made up of white males and published. And it has not been retracted, although the outcry has been pretty large in academic communities, that not only was this kind of a horrific idea to start with, but the research methods used to back it up were completely unethical and unfounded. And the fact that this magazine or journal has very little diversity in its editorial staff is what allowed it to go through and actually get published. It really struck home to me how devaluing work like this is for Asian women. And it really underlined the devaluement that happens around sex work and sexuality for Asian women in particular. And of course, now I'm going to turn to the shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, in which we saw that play out as well. You know, the reason why you can go around and have a killing spree is that you have really devalued a group of human beings in your mind and projected onto them a problem that is really not the problem that they have caused or are responsible for. It was so interesting to me to watch the police spokesperson who talked right after these shootings, who needs to listen to Dr. Cheeseboro talk about intersectionality, because he's like, when people said, this is yet another Asian hate crime, which we know has been on the rise, he said, oh, you know, I think this was more of like a sex thing. Well, for Asian women, it is very hard to separate being Asian, being women, and the sexual stereotypes that are embedded in that intersection. So it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think that for a lot of people who live at an intersection, that's really obvious. But I think there are a lot of folks in America for whom that intersection is still something we need to explore and think about. So those are my remarks for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Todd. That was wonderful as well. I appreciate the distinguishing between sexism and misogyny. I think that's really good for people to hear, especially in this conversation. And I especially appreciate that last bit of remarks about sex work and sexuality and the devaluing of human life. I mean, truly dehumanization based on identity. So I appreciate that contribution to this conversation. Thank you. So that gives us an opportunity now to hear from our next panelist, who is Vivian Hardison, who serves as the Assistant Director of Disability Support Services at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And she also serves as a certified rehab counselor. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Vivian.
Thank you, Lindy. So I'm very much going to piggyback and rope everything in that Dr. Todd and Dr. Cheeseboro spoke about, because in my field for disability, when we start talking about different identities and how those go together, disability in and of itself is going to be one thing about a person, not talking about their race, not talking about their sexual orientation, not talking about anything else, just that disability in and of itself. So historically, the ADA piggybacked off of the civil rights movement. It was a move for people with disabilities to have equal rights. However, voices that were left out of that conversation were BIPOC voices. It was very much, in essence, a white movement, and how, much like the feminist movement that kind of forgot some of the voices, the same thing happened with the disability movement. So when we start looking at students or people with disabilities, and we start looking at the differentiation of the races and classes, it starts to break slowly apart. So for our institution, we mostly have white students that receive the majority of accommodations, and come in also with formal assessments done, and also with documentation stuff from high school. Historically, Black students, Latino students have been diagnosed with a behavior disorder versus them actually having another disability, such as a learning disability or something like that. So it almost created a pipeline from them going from having a behavioral issue to them being seen like that and how they identify as having that behavioral issue, into then being either institutionalized or being incarcerated because of this, instead of being properly assessed and being properly treated for an actual disability that they had. So much like the much how students are represented, how the majority of students are represented in some schools is predominantly white. When we break down into other parts of it, it's the same, it's the exact same thing. We see more white students that will have more privilege in those areas than other students. Now, if you throw culture into that piece, a lot of students of color were not able to be diagnosed because their families did not have money, did not know the background of the disability, did not know how that label was going to affect their child as they're growing up and as they're moving through life. So for us, when we get to the college level, they come to a point where they've reached their maximum capacity without accommodations. And then what? They never had the formal assessment. They never had the opportunity to even talk about this situation. Or in my case, I have students with parents that don't speak English. And so there's a language barrier also there that they were never able to assess. And so those polarized identities, we don't belong to one. Your umbrella, it's just you're taking which piece of the pie you essentially belong to create this one identity. And which one do you choose to most identify with if the world won't take every single one of your identities? You're either disabled or not, you're either Latino or not, but how do you mesh all of those? So just as an example of how these things have played out in the media, things that we've learned, for those who have seen When They See Us, Corey Wise, he had not only a hearing disability, but he also had a learning disability. And he wasn't present when it happened. He got the longest sentence out of all the children, they were children, that got sentenced. And they didn't have the backup to say what happened here. How did this happen to him? Why did this happen to him? And so it's a similar idea that people of color have to struggle with being marginalized all over again when they have a disability on top of it. So they have their skin weighing against them. If you're a woman, that weighs against you as well. So it's just compacting all these things into who you are and how the world is going to treat you, essentially. There's been several famous people with disabilities that we don't really talk about. Harriet Tubman had epilepsy. It's not very common. Maya Angelou didn't speak for 5 years after she was traumatized. Again, we don't talk about it all that often, that these people have done these amazing things, but we focus so much on the fact that she was a Black activist or she saved slaves from being killed. However, she also had a disability on top of this. So how does that play into her identity? Did it play into their identity at all? And so we kind of shift that to the side a little bit, and it's still stigmatized versus it being something that you can own and something that is a part of you. But it can be and should be owned the same way everything else can, because it is a part of your daily life. It's not the person that's necessarily disabled, it's how the world treats them that makes them disabled, and how we don't have universal design to everything. So sometimes a building in and of itself is going to make a person feel more or less disabled than they are. The way they're treated, the way everything is set up for them is going to make a difference for them. So just like, the intersectionality of that comes, I think, full fold once you add something else on top of it. And it welcomes this idea that when we look at a person, we really are just getting a very small section of them, because there's so much more buried underneath there that needs to be discussed and needs to be identified in that person so that we can understand that person as a whole. Thanks, Lindy.
Thank you, Vivian. Actually, Vivian, you have our first question of the evening. So before we go to the next panelist, I wanted to make sure I asked it since it applies to what you directly said. So thank you, Melissa, from the audience. So Vivian, do you have one or two recommendations on how institutions can take a more active role to better mitigate the misdiagnoses among BIPOC students?
Absolutely. One of the larger things, I think, students coming in still, because they've grown up with the idea that it's stigmatized. Having those conversations of normalizing it. Disability courses should not just be a course that you take because you're specializing in it. It should be something that you are learning in your core curriculum that should be in inclusion. Diversity often falls by the wayside when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, but it needs to be a big portion of it just because of how much it intersects with everything else. And there are a lot more people walking around with some sort of disability than what people actually think of. And it's because we always relate disability to something visible. But that's, that's far from it. So definitely having institutions embed it into their DEI efforts, having more classes about it, and honestly, including disability students and disability professionals in that conversation. Most of the time, they think of the disability office as somebody to contact when something goes wrong. No, contact us at the beginning so we can help identify, send them our way, and having those conversations in your multicultural classes that you're going to have a lot of students of color in, stressing the normalization of it, because you're reteaching something to them at that point. They're learning to overcome a stigma at that point, things that they've learned in the media, things that they've learned at home, things that family members might have experienced. You're breaking down those stigmas that were once attached to it. So thank you, Melissa, for the question.
Thank you, Vivian. And thank you, Melissa and Tanya, for actively being on our YouTube channel and commenting. Much appreciated. And also, Vivian, I want to say thank you also for what you just said. I appreciate that last answer too about the reteaching, right? Because I think a lot of times, especially with ability and disability, I think there's a lot of conversations that we have to retrain our brain on what our perceptions are. So I really appreciate that is your contribution here as well. Okay, and now that brings us to another wonderful panelist who is here with us today. That's Zebediah Hall, who serves as the Director of Student Disability Services at Cornell University, and also serves on the Board of Directors as the Equity Officer for the Board of Directors on AHEAD. So thank you for joining us from Cornell, and please, the floor is yours, Zebediah.
Thank you. I'm super appreciative to be in space and time with everybody. Just mention a couple of things that I heard. Intentionality does not mention outcome. I think that's super, super important as we think about intersectionality. We talked a little bit about devaluing, and so that's really, really interesting. When we think about the impact of intersectionality, it plays out in killings. We talked about that a little bit. It plays out in productivity, right? Who do we think is productive versus not? It shows up in pay. It shows up in our healthcare, right? But what it really shows up in is access and opportunity, right? At the core of it, when we start to break this down. And so one of the things I'll talk about a little bit, as Vivian started to allude to it, is ableism. And we think about ableism and we started to unpack this from a historical context. What I started to think about is for certain religions that actually have sin, it was considered a sin to be disabled. When we started to unpack ableism, I think this is really, really important, right? I think it's also important to understand that babies were actually dropped off the balcony to die. They were left in the street and abandoned. And we get the word handicap from somebody having their cap in their hand. So when you see the term handicap, is a very derogatory term, no difference than you see the N word, not monolithic, not one and the same. Individuals with disabilities, disabled people actually went to jail. I think this kind of stuff is really, really important as we lift this ableism conversation up. And I'll tell you why it's so important. Because when you go back to the 1880s, people who speak English as a second language were considered disabled. So for my European brothers and sisters in the room that did not speak English as your native tongue, you were considered disabled. Very poor people were considered disabled. Sex workers were considered disabled. Immigrants were considered disabled. Slaves and free slaves, we're talking about the 1880s. Why is that so important? Because society at that time in the Western context thought those individuals was bad. Connecting that to disability, we thought disabled was bad. So we labeled those people under that group. That's highly important for us to know as we start to unpack this, because that's intersectionality playing out from a historical context from those different groups and those identities. And when we think about those same identities playing out today and how that affects us, we get to the word, what do we say? People with disability? Do we say disabled people? I think that's really important. No difference than I would say, I'm a Black male, right? She alluded that I'm the director of student disability services at Cornell University. I'm a Black male that happens to be the director of student disability service at Cornell. I'm not the director of Cornell that happens to be a Black male. So when I talk about myself from an identity first language. I'm a Black male because I'm owning the political, the economic, the oppression that comes with my Blackness. As we talk about disabled people, let's use identity first language so we can own that oppression within that environmental context, the societal context that come along with it. A person or disabled people are not disabled unless the environment produces barriers that do not give them access and opportunity. And as we think about reframing, reconceptualizing, because the point of this conversation of intersectionality is starting to reconceptualize. An example of reframing some of those things is what I think about now as we get into COVID. COVID was very prevalent, right? I mean, not COVID was very prevalent. Things that were disparities were very prevalent before COVID. A lot of people are having aha moments during COVID and starting to understand disparities in a really different way. I think as we think about comorbidity, right? The intersectionality of comorbidity as it relates to the Black and brown bodies during COVID gives some individuals an understanding why it's affecting those communities more, our communities more. The intersectionality of Black and brown, comorbidities with certain diagnoses that put us at risk more, gives some people an understanding of why Black and brown bodies are dying at a higher rate as it relates to COVID. Nobody's unpacking those disparities that was prevalent before COVID. Those same intersectionality that we talked about, healthcare, racism, right? One of the questions, and I'll just respond a little bit that I believe Melissa asked is, how do we serve those community? Don't medicalize our process. We don't have to have medical documentation for us to put accommodations in place. That's engaging in a different kind of way. I think sometimes in our community, when we're talking about the disabled community and the Black and brown community, I might not be able to go to my parents and say that I have anxiety or I have depression. I might not have access to a clinical provider, but what I might have access to is my youth pastor. And my youth pastor might say, I engage with Zebediah in such a way that I did these things so he did certain tasks so he can keep his attention on what he's doing. We can use that information like documentation to then be able to put accommodations in place, because the intersectionality that Vivian described of our Black and brown community and then ableism might not be prevalent for them to have medical documentation, might not be prevalent for them to have those kind of conversations. When we also thinking about comorbidity and how it affects our Black and brown bodies, I think about craniology and what craniology did to say that Black and brown bodies were inferior to white bodies. And everything that we're talking about from an intersectionality standpoint goes against white supremacy, and it attacks the hegemonic society of the intersectionality of the male and whiteness. And what we're trying to do is deconstruct and reframe. And what we're doing is tending to the things that matter. What I'll talk a little bit about too is me as an individual. I'm a young Black male at a predominantly white institution that happened to be Ivy League. I lead my department. The people within my department, there might be 2 individuals that are actually younger than me. And then I are talking about accommodation. So I'm going into spaces where faculty most of the time don't look like me. And then I'm engaging with them around how they should give access and opportunity. And the devaluing of that disabled community is important. But I got to understand my identity as a Black male going to talk about the largest underrepresented, marginalized group, disabled community. And how do I show up in that space when I'm the only one in that meeting that looks like me? And now I'm trying to navigate a space to give somebody access and opportunity. What is the impact of that? Right? I said productivity when I first started to talk. What does productivity look like for the disabled community? When you have to be in a lab? What does that look like when A disabled person can't be in the lab as long as somebody else, because for their health, they need to be able to do certain things so they come back to the lab the next day. That's understandable. But now if you put demographics on there and say that's a woman of color, there's a devaluing of her productivity. There's a devaluing that happens there. And I think those things are important. I'll close a little bit talking about privilege and power, because the impact of intersectionality really goes to privilege and power. There's some things that I can say being marginalized as a Black male because my maleness that my women of color might not be able to say. How do I use my power of my maleness in that space? Because what we're doing is getting into gray spaces, because it's not black and white when we're talking about intersectionality. And when we start to unpack that at a really high level, we have to tend to the things that matter. One of the things that I pride myself on, no matter what I do, is I'm in it, but I'm not of it. When we're talking about intersectionality, one of the things I think about is Plato's Apology. In Plato's Apology, they talked about parrhesia. How did Socrates get in trouble for parrhesia? Frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech. It will get you in trouble. How many of us got some John Lewis in us that's going to get in good trouble? Because it takes that to do the intersectionality work. That's the impact. I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, Lindy.
Thank you, Zebediah. There's so many great things. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I think that it was great to hear about not only access and opportunity, but the reframing and the nod to privilege and power, and can't ever go wrong with a little talk about good trouble either. So thank you for that. I appreciate it very much. And that brings us to our final panelist before we bring it more open for questions, and I pose some additional ones for our panelists. And that final panelist today is Alexander Works, my apologies, who is from our SIU School of Medicine and is a medical doctorate candidate who was recently matched at Northwestern for internal medicine. So congratulations, Alexander. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lindy, for inviting me to talk about this topic, intersectionality. And I'm so glad to be here to give you guys the Black male piece and combine it with the LGBTQ gay cis male piece as well. It's very interesting because I have not heard too many conversations about the intersectionality between both. Because usually on one side, in terms of the LGBTQ side, it's usually brushed under the rug because there are problems or situation in the LGBTQ side as well in terms of white privilege and having a lot of preferences, or which is actually prejudice and racism. But there's also a part of being LGBTQ in the Black community, which there's a lot of effects from Black masculinity and just also homophobia as well. But and I'll just bring in some examples, especially as a Black male, also LGBTQ. There is, we've all been talking about the topic of devalue, dehumanizing, especially because LGBTQ very majority white or also racially ambiguous white looking men do have this preference against do have all these preferences, especially racial hangups, very more than I expected when I was, coming out and just exploring the community. A lot of people back in the day, I would say, if they put on their, Grindr profiles. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Grindr here, but this is an example. Like back in the day in college, don't want to talk to Blacks, don't want to talk to Latinos, don't want to talk to Asian. It's just no Blacks, no Blacks, no Blacks after one after the other. And a lot of people assume, oh, the LGBTQ community, oh, they're about all equality. They're about, they're not gonna, judge anyone on anything because they are in this space. They are also marginalized. Why would they do that to other people? But I mean, there's marginalization within marginalized groups. And I would say that is my experience of being in the LGBTQ community. But if it's not just shutting someone out because of preferences or because of racial hangups, it's also you are, what do you call it? You're also fetishized. And being fetishized means you're also being dehumanized as well. So it's either they're not interested or they are, or you're just a fetish to them. Of course, that's not everyone, but it's enough people to where it has a large impact on how you feel in that community, and also causes a little sense of loneliness as well. But, you know, we're more talking about racism and intersectionality and everyone's specific, you know, own identities and, you know, the marginalization that comes with them. I think we're doing a little bit better about that and talking about it. So that's, you know, one example. Also, I wanted to bring up the whole ACT UP movement. And ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And it focused on trying to end or work on ending the AIDS pandemic. And really that movement really pushed towards getting antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS, and really sparked that push of science to really, you know, get management. But also when we see in that movement is I know someone mentioned the silencing of BIPOC voices. BIPOC LGBTQ were not really represented. It was more of white, or I would say racially ambiguous white, their voices being heard, them being the heroes of the movement. And we were like silenced and, you know, dehumanized in that way. But also there's an experience in the Black community and being a person of LGBTQ, you know, there is that topic of masculinity is very sensitive in that community. And just, even though I didn't have too much experience with it, but I know other people who have had those experiences in which being LGBTQ, a part of that community, is just not acceptable at all. And in my heart, definitely, you know, another intersection like Black and trans, and another, you know, example of that is when I would say Dwayne Wade's daughter, Zaya, transitioned from male to female. And when that all came out in the news and social media, oh my God, my Black brothers and sisters were just going in on Zaya, like, no, that's a boy, that's a he, that's a boy, that's a he. No, we're not calling a boy, a she. Is not happening. And comments after comments after comments. And then hearing that also from people in my Black community, it's just like, it just amazes me how both of these groups experience marginalization, but they want to also cause marginalization in their own communities. And it's just really a different experience, you know, handling both. Granted, I just gave an example of the trans community. You know, I'm not trans, but still it's a part of my community, LGBTQ community. And it's just interesting. I think it's appropriate to talk more about intersectionality, you know, handling these multiple different labels and the specific experiences that people have from them. I think we're used to focusing on one or the other, but there is a unique experience of handling both of these identities for sure. But that's what I have to say for now. And I want to thank you for giving me this, you know, the podium to speak about it. So.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And I really actually appreciate too this conversation about marginalization within marginalization, right? Because I think that that is its own intersectional discrimination, because we do know race and color so intertwined, right? But there's certain experiences of people based on their skin tone, right? We have all these different conversations. And even like you said, this decision of, you know, racially ambiguous or white individuals in the LGBT community versus those who might be BIPOC. So I appreciate that addition to the conversation. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And with that, I will say to our audience, I'm going to be asking some additional questions, but we certainly open up the floor for additional questions. If you have any, please place them in the YouTube chat and we will get those to our panelists. And I'm going to watch those, but also I do have a few that I'd like to pose to the panel. So they're not necessarily specific. So panelists, if you have an answer, you're more than welcome to jump in of your own volition. I will not necessarily call on you, so feel free to jump in. I think we have talked a little bit about the experiences, and Dr. Cheeseboro kind of set it up for some things we should be thinking of as we think about intersectional discrimination. But I was wondering if you could all kind of maybe talk a little bit about what do you think is the main benefit of us actually understanding what intersectional discrimination is? Like, how will it help us taking this perspective moving forward?
If I can just go and answer first, I'll just say that I think intersectionality is just good for us. It just makes us aware. I think it's so. I think especially speaking as an African American, the African American history of discrimination is one of those things that so well documented that virtually nobody in the country denies it. I mean, people may downplay it or may say it's overblown or may say that it's over, but nobody denies the reality of what happened, what has happened. And I think because we live in a polarized society that we're quite often people either don't mix or they mix at a very, very superficial level. It's easy, you know, if you are Black and straight, that you know yourself. You don't know anybody else. And I think another thing too, with the predominance of Christianity as the dominant religion and Islam as a strong minority religion among African Americans, with a strong emphasis on traditional sex roles, gender roles, a moral code based on, you know, very ancient values. It's really easy to fall into anti-gay bias and to not be receptive to a broader understanding of gender roles and that sort of thing. So anything that makes us think outside of the box is just good for us. I mean, because we have to know the world beyond us if we're really going to be good people to others.
Thank you, Dr. Cheeseboro. Anyone else want to add to that?
You know, I think if you're interested in an intervention or something wherever you work, you have to think a little bit about some of those intersections, because if you pick a non-representative group and ask them a question, you might get a, oh, we're all fine kind of answer. So it helps me to think about these intersections in terms of what groups are chronically overlooked when we ask how people are doing, and helps me target interventions to the groups that are really feeling whatever the problem is I'm trying to work on.
I'll just say the benefit of intersectionality is getting to the pain points, the really hard conversations, the things that people dodge. I think sometimes when we're doing it, how do we do it in ways that we tell metaphors? For example, sometimes people say with the Black Lives Matter movement, doesn't all lives matter? The Me Too movement, we have so many things going on. We have with the Asian community going on right now. One of the things that I think about, if we lived in a cul-de-sac and there was a house that was on fire and the fire department came into that cul-de-sac, they're not going to spray water on every house. They're going to only spray water on the house that's burning, right? And everybody that hear that story would say, that makes sense. That's what we're going to do. Then what you do is put demographics on that. Say that's a Black house that's burning. And then the white lives can be the neighbors because they're saying, hey, bring me your kids. Do you need help? And the blue lives can be the fire department. Or in that same story, now that we said Black lives, you can say, well, it caught on fire because maybe they didn't keep their electric up to code. And then there comes all these different reasons and rationales of why. And what it is you tell that metaphor and you agree with it the first time I told it, you get to those pain points, those touch points. Intersectionality brings about the uncomfortability of the conversations we try to dodge.
Thank you both. That was great. Any other from the panelists? I have actually another question from the crowd, which I'm really excited about. So I just want to see if anyone wants to answer the last one first. Okay, so Tanya, thank you for your question. So Tanya states that a couple of the panelists have stated they identify as biracial. As the mother of biracial children, I would love to hear more about how they have come to a place of owning their identity in society. I know who owns their identity, so I also own the identity, but I'm going to wait because I know that there's panelists who own this identity, so I pass it to them.
Okay, I'll start. I am half Black, half Guatemalan. I grew up speaking Spanish, being very aware of the fact that my dad was a lot darker than me and my brother. And growing up, it was difficult because society kind of wanted me to choose one or the other. Are you a Latina or are you Black? Well, you're not Latina enough for us because, because of this reason. You're not Black enough because you're not this dark. And so growing up, it was kind of trying to decide which side I belonged to and who I belonged to. And really, as I got older, it became more of realizing that I didn't have to pick between the two. I had to realize that I belonged to both. I could own both, I could represent both, and I could stand up for both. All in all, I knew where, for myself, what that meant. I had to learn to own my privilege as a light-skinned Black woman. Because if I'm walking with my father, if I'm walking with somebody darker than me, they don't think I'm his child because of how much darker he is than me. But being able to say that, very passionately that this was my papi and he always will be, no matter what, was important to me. And so now, I think that societal changes that we're seeing, and we're seeing more minority groups come together in a really difficult time with everything that's going on. Surrounding yourself with people that are going to encourage everything that you are, regardless of what that is. I have a group of friends that are all Black, they are all darker than me, and they have never once pointed out the fact that I was very much lighter than them, and it never mattered. And so they understand my differences and they acknowledge my cultural differences and they acknowledge me as a person and they love me for those differences, not in spite of them. So navigating the world was a little difficult when I was younger, but once I got to a point of realizing I don't have to choose, this is what I am, this is who I'm going to be, regardless. I can't change the way that the world sees me, but I can change how I see myself and how I own my identities.
I really am resonating with a lot of that. Every time I took a test or applied for a job, they say name and then they say age and then they say race. And you either have to pick between your mom and your dad, or you have to declare yourself an other, which is a little bit of a knife in the back as well. And when I was a kid, I remember filling out forms like that, like for the SATs, and having like a little mini existential crisis every time I had to, because I didn't know if I was supposed to pick my mom or my dad, or even what it meant, or who this data meant to whom. It's kind of stressful, and definitely feeling like one community kind of is like, well, maybe not totally with us, and then the other community giving you the same response. But there are positives too, you know, and the older you get, the more you own your own identity and you seek out your own friends. That's all great. I think some of the other things I learned that have turned into strengths have been the ability to code switch. A lot of my friends did not know what I was talking about, but I am different with other Japanese people than I am with other Scotch-Irish people from Kentucky, than I am with doctors, than I am with non-doctors. And I really have that ability to code switch. And it's been an extremely useful skill to realize that people contain multitudes and it's all good.
So I know that I also identify that way, so I'll make it snappy since I'm a moderator, but I also, that makes 3 of us on the panel. So I did mention it as well. I also identify as, well, I say multiracial for a lot of reasons, but we don't have to go into that right now. But I do have a parent who identifies as white and one who identifies as Mexican American, so Latina was how I would say. But similar and resonating also with what Dr. Todd and Vivian were saying is there is this often existential crisis of how do I need to identify? And also the eternal question, which I'm confident you've both been asked, is what are you? So the objectification of your identity as well. Instead of being a who, you become this object of curiosity and interest. And so to be truthful, I'm a PhD student and I'm pursuing it with the research around colorism, which is why race and color has resonated with me so strongly, because there is also a consistent conversation of being too much of or not enough of, which I think both of these wonderful panelists have alluded to. And so I think in answer to the question of how can you help your children with owning their identity, I think one is your own education, right? About how it happens and how code switching happens and how I think Alexander mentioned racial ambiguity, right? That becomes this question of if you become multiracial, biracial, if this is who you are by birth, there's this racial ambiguity that happens as well. And how people see you in different things, like how I'm seen in diversity work or how certain people are seen in Black Lives Matter movements based on their skin tone. So there's this extra underlying conversation that layers on top of the question of how you identify. So I would think about if you are this parent with these multiracial, biracial children to consider like the words you use and how you articulate their own identity, but also what that means in the spaces and the environments that they're in as well. Because I think how you conceptualize your children and how you conceptualize those around you will make a difference in how they see themselves. So yes, and I'll go back to moderator now, but thanks for everyone giving me a momentary platform. We actually have an additional question coming in, and actually I didn't mean to cut off, but I believe that's the people who have identified outly. Yes. Okay, yes. As I think in the panel. So we actually have another question from Jen, thank you. So for all the panelists, what are some favorite or recommended books or other reading the panelists would recommend to dive further into intersectionality or other areas of interest that might help us in this conversation?
I would just mention an author. It's a work of fiction, but I remember a few years ago I read this book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, if I believe I remember the name correctly, called Americana, and she talks about being a Nigerian who comes to America. She spends time in Britain. She spends time in America, and learning how to negotiate the intersectionality of being Nigerian, and then coming to the West and all of a sudden realizing that her Nigerian identity, like for instance, in her case, she's Igbo, that once she got outside of the Nigerian community in America, that was very much secondary to being seen as a Black woman. I mean, it's not that's a work of fiction, but I think it's a good kind of experience just to read that, to learn how people negotiate different identities. I mean, as for more formal academic works on it, I can't recommend it, but I know there are a number of novels that deal with the issues of ethnic identity or biracial identity that I think can be pretty useful in terms of putting yourself in other people's experience.
Love this book. by Ioma Oluo. So you want to talk about race. Because there are sections about a lot of questions like, can I use the N-word? What is an intersectionality? Is police brutality really a thing? And what I love about this book is if you want to continue to have these conversations with people, it really gives kind of a good baseline from which to start to have a more productive discussion. And I'll shout out for a fiction work. I forget the author's name, but it's called The Sun is Also a Star. It's about, I think, a Korean boy and a Black girl who have a relationship. They're teenagers. And it's just a really great book that explores how that all works out and clashes against each other and also harmonizes. And it's definitely a book that like high school age kids could read.
I'll just throw out there, not necessarily a book, but Dr. Eddie Glaude, he does a lot of work on devaluing. I think he talks about the value gap a lot. So Dr. Eddie Glaude would be a good person for that. I think about, depending on how you want to unpack intersectionality, that's going to be important. But I think even thinking about Dr. Claude Steele, when you talk about stereotype threat, I think that's super important if we're trying to unpack intersectionality, because how it plays out in those different things and understanding that type of part, that aspect of it, I mean. So I think those kind of things are important. There's some reading on social justice things that impact some of those kind of things. But I think for me, when I think about this concept, and I think somebody said it earlier, it's really, when we think about these chief diversity officers, or we think about these VPs for inclusion, it's always important to me that most of the time they come in with a portfolio that doesn't have ableism included. And I think about, when that's the largest marginalized group, and we think about intersectionality, how much more work do we need to do with the disabled community? Because sometimes that's not prevalent in the research. I think about how it shows up when we think about note taking. Sometimes faculty is like, the best way to take notes is like this, and this is what's better, but that study didn't have disabled students in it. And I think when we unpack intersectionality, can we go to a place of understanding ableism connected to racism and start from there, and using critical race theory and that kind of stuff to unpack it.
I was going to suggest a movie that's a good example of intersectionality, like Black African male part and also LGBTQ part. Moonlight, the Academy Award-winning movie film in 2016. Moonlight, amazing movie. It shows you his journey growing up in Miami. And I think it's just a great example. It's just one example, but great movie, so.
Just to toss another one, if you go do some research on the Black Panther Party, it talks about a lot of intersectionality from an oppression lens. If people know Judy Heumann, in 1973, when they did Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, it was the Black Panther Party that actually fed them when they actually did their sit-ins. And it was individuals in the LGBT community that actually came and bathed them and washed their hair. So when you think about the Black Panther Party and intersectionality, they was talking about oppression over in China way before Vietnam and those kind of things, way before others was talking about it. So it's a way of unpacking oppression too. So just a thought.
Just to add on to that, not a book, but a documentary on Netflix that came out last year. It's called Crip Camp, Disability Revolution, who Zebediah mentioned, Judy Heumann is in that documentary. And it's on Netflix. It's great. And it talks about just how they came to be about fighting about disability revolution, and just includes footage from that time and what Crip Camp was. So that's a plug in there for that documentary.
I would also say I made mention in the introductory remarks about Kimberly Crenshaw, especially if you want to know a little bit more about intersectionality. Her scholarly article would be a helpful foundational piece. But also, I mentioned Dr. Ibram Kendi, who I happen to have here as well. How to Be an Anti-Racist is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. And that talked a little bit about those intersections immediately of race and another identity, which we know there's other intersections, but that seems to be one that a lot of people are talking about right now. So if you're interested in that conversation, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi would be a good one as well, I would recommend. Any other recommendations before I move on to any other questions? I'm also scanning the comments, and there's a lot of great comments coming into the YouTube chat as well. Any other recommendations before I move on. Oh, I would also say maybe another interesting one is Code Switch, which is an NPR podcast. Code Switch, they are always talking about all sorts of current topics of race and gender and terms and interactions. And especially if you like podcasts, I would recommend that one as well. Any other recommendations before I go to the next question? Okay, we also had another comment that colorism could be another YouTube conversation in itself. So shout out to Conversations of Understanding and being good conversations. Thank you for that. Because we had someone mention that while they're not mixed race, they're a light-skinned Black woman, and that creates its own experience as well. So thank you, and shout out to, I believe, Melissa, who mentioned that. Thank you. Okay, so we did mention also a little bit about this privilege piece, right? We've kind of actually talked about it a little bit. And I'm curious if we could highlight maybe either in your own experience or how you can see privilege having a part, or how do we use our privilege when we encounter or see these intersectional discriminations in action?
I think for myself, as a mixed woman that fluently speaks Spanish, I insert myself into situations where I know that other people cannot speak English because I know what's being said about them. And so I do insert myself into situations that I probably should not. However, it is a privilege for me to be able to speak both languages fluently and be able to switch back and forth as necessary. Also, when in situations where students are being discriminated against, or I feel they're being discriminated against on the basis of disability, I understand that disability more than others would, and they understand their disability more than anybody else would because that's their lived experience. So those are other situations that I insert myself in, and as a rehab counselor, I have that privilege to be able to be a voice when necessary. Even though we, one of our ethical standards is autonomy, it is a privilege to be able to help them when necessary if they ask. Coming from a family where my aunts don't speak that fluent of English, I've kind of been able to play that role for them. So for me, with just in places where I can use that privilege, I definitely do to try and help other people.
I think that people who live at these intersections, the more intersections they live at, the more they can sometimes be victims of tokenism. And they're kind of the only person like that in the room. And when someone mentions a particular issue, everybody kind of turns and looks at them. So, this is a place where I think, one of the areas where I know I have privilege in society is I'm heterosexual. So instead of my LGBT colleague always being the person who has to say, have we thought about how this policy will affect the LGBT community? Always having to be the person who brings it up, I can bring it up because I care about that community too, and kind of diffuse some of that tokenism that I think definitely happens in some circles.
I'd like to mention some cases in which I realized I was privileged. Now, one of the major areas I had that experience was when I was a graduate student, when I was, I'd say like maybe a second year PhD student at Michigan State. And I was studying with a young woman, and it was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and the library on campus stayed up until about 1 o'clock. And he said, I really need to go to the library right now. And I said, well, why don't you just go on? I said, well, it's 10 o'clock at night. I really don't feel safe going to the library. And, believe it or not, although I was like 27, 28 years old, that was the first time it ever really hit me that women had to be concerned about that kind of thing. I mean, for me, it's a college campus. It's a pretty safe environment. The only thing I really worried about at Michigan State was that they had really, really big raccoons. And, I was always afraid to run into one with rabies or something. But in terms of violence or being harassed or whatever, that never occurred to me. I was 27 years old, a big guy. I was not the kind of person that was likely to get jumped. And so that made me aware. The other thing that really made me aware of intersectionality was my experience doing research. I remember when I was doing my dissertation research in the Sudan. This was back in 1990, when the Civil War was going on between the North and the South. Eventually, the country split up, and the country I did my research now in is now the Republic of Sudan. And that war was largely between people who define themselves as Black and largely Christian in the South, and people in the North who define themselves as Arab, although Sudanese Arabs, in the context of America, 99% of them would be considered Black, but they consider themselves Arab, and they were Muslim. And I just remember being in Sudan and just realizing how well I was treated. Even though there was a lot of dislike of Southerners, and I clearly was not a Muslim. I was, I wasn't like going around proselytizing or anything, but I didn't hide the fact that I was a Baptist, and I spoke decent Arabic at the time, but still, I did not try to pretend I was part of the in group, but was treated very, very well, and it made me realize how, when people are visitors to a country, you get that kind of hospitality. I mean, it's something that, dealing with, Africans who come to America, quite often it may take them a long time to realize that America has deep-seated issues with race. Because when they come to America, they're foreign, especially if they're like in a college environment or they're skilled workers. They have accents, they're interesting. And, people who might not normally deal with a person who's born in America who looks like that African, may be very nice to them. And the one other aspect I would mention is that I remember a couple of times as an African American finding myself dealing with white Americans in ways that I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have been dealing with if we were both back home. I mean, all of a sudden we found ourselves, we were both foreigners, in the case of Sudan, in South Africa, Nigeria, all of a sudden I was the American. I may not be the guy who maybe lived next door that they would have hung out with, or that might have been the case on my side too. But in the context of being foreigners in a different country, all of a sudden our Americanness meant a whole lot more than our racial difference. And so to me, that's a way in which intersectionality and especially in the case of issues of gender, privilege really became much more apparent to me.
I'll add that to be able to use your privilege, you got to first know who you are and who your identities are. And then you got to know what identities are salient in the space. And then once you know who you are, your identities, what identities salient in space, then you got to have confidence, right? Because then you got to be able to utilize the privilege for what it's worth, right? So I think those things are really, really important. I think the ways that it showed up sometimes for me is I played college basketball, and I know that there were some things that we got that soccer maybe didn't get, or other teams didn't get. And so when it came time for resources, as being one of the captains of the team, and we were talking about bringing other teams on, we could have voted to bring other teams on, or we could have voted not to because we didn't already have enough resources for the teams that were already at play. How do you use my privilege and the resources being a starting point guard on the basketball team at that time to use my privilege? Another way of using privilege, I think, trying to once again raise this ableist conversation in the space, right, is accommodations. Everything we do in life, we accommodate people, right? We didn't say that we're disabled and we need people to be on Zoom, but right now we're using Zoom, right? COVID is making us use Zoom in a different kind of way. Some individuals go to hotels and motels all the time and they want to be accommodated. Every time I use my cell phone, it accommodates me to communicate with somebody. Every time I type my email, it accommodates me to communicate with somebody. Every time I get in my car, it accommodates me to drive. It's not until a disabled person say, I have a disability and I need you to accommodate or redesign this process that accommodations is frowned upon. How do I use my privilege to call it out when we frown upon the disabled community wanting accommodation and we actually want accommodations all the time? That's our reality. But it also starts at home, right? How do we call out our loved ones, right? If an individual uses retarded around me, I'm gonna say, come on now. Why would you use that language? I don't let it slide and scapegoat. Because if I let it slide and scapegoat at home, I'm then not gonna use my privilege outward. When we're talking about Blackness, and Alex, I'm sorry if I can call you that, alluded to it a lot, right? When we're talking about the LGBT community and then we're talking about it within the Black community, unpacking that with my elders in the Black community was really, really tough, because what they were connecting it to is how white men treated them and stripped away their masculinity, right? And so the intersectionality of it was really different than unpacking. And how did I use my privilege for the individuals in my family that identified in the LGBTQ plus community to then talk about and unpack some of that kind of stuff. But part of using your privilege is also understanding where that pain point is coming from. I didn't shun my elders that were Black males that struggle with that because I knew what place it was coming from. But that didn't mean I let them scapegoat because of that reality. And how do you actually do that? That's the touch points. That's the privilege.
And I'll just reiterate what everyone else has said. It's just, you know, using your privilege, for example, me using my privilege as a male and also standing in solidarity for women's rights. Just also being a part of like the conversation, having an active voice in the conversation. I had the opportunity to, moderate and talk on a he for she panel within the SIU School of Medicine. And I think that was an amazing opportunity to also stand in solidarity for women's rights as well. And it's just like knowing how to, resonate, with a different, identity and, using your privilege, your voice to also take in part of their conversations and stand in solidarity with them as well.
Dr. Cheeseboro also mentioned allyship, right? How do I actually use the platform and the spaces that I have to actually shut up and get out of the way so people that identify it take up that space and speak, right? That's also part of it.
Anyone else want to answer that question about privilege and intersectional discrimination before I have another question? Watch out, so many questions from me. Here we go. So here's the next one. I think this kind of applies to a little bit about what we've been talking about and some people's personal experiences and sharing about your offices and things that you do on campus as well, is how can the university support individuals who have a certain identity without negating then the experiences and identities of others in the community. For example, if we're going to talk about race, do we talk about one identity versus another? Because that creates then that intersectional potential discrimination. So how can the university support individuals of certain identities without negating others?
I guess I'll start since I'm the outsider, if that's okay. I think we got to do a little bit of the hard work. I think we throw around the term BIPOC. I think we throw around the term people of color. I think we throw around the term or letters for the LGBT community. None of that's monolithic. If I had an event for people of color, I have an individual that always tell me what kind of food would you have? Because what culture do you have for people of color? How do we not be lazy and just call people of color? Because then what, if you're people of color, then you're just non-white, right? How do we actually unpack that in a different kind of way? I think also, how do we reconceptualize and redesign? I think about it in my space. Sometimes when you go into buildings at Cornell, when you walk into those buildings, you walk right into steps. And for individuals that are in motorized scooters and individuals that are in wheelchairs, they accommodate them by coming down and have meetings with them. But actually, if they met with all the students down there, what they then did was make that process a little bit more equitable. But what it did was it didn't give an individual denial of privacy. So now an individual doesn't have to go to Vivian to get an accommodation because they don't have asthma and they can't walk up the stairs, right? And so part of this is how do you get to a place where I'll say it for myself. I don't have a job at Cornell, so students don't have to come to me to have accommodations, right? But I have a job because people are coming to us on the front end to help redesign and reconceptualize processes so we can think about access and opportunity. I think when we also think about this from a systematic standpoint, we got to think about the systems that we don't control that are connected to our systems. And if I use the example of healthcare, because there are disparities there. I use the example of racism. And if I know those things are to be true, if I say that a person has to have medical or clinical documentation to receive accommodations, I already said a subset of my students can't receive my services. So how do I control my processes and my systems by understanding the processes and systems that connect to mine from a systematic standpoint so I can make the appropriate changes? I think those things are important. I think we can't forget who we are. I can tell you for me, my father's always been on disability ever since I was born. My mom's been the breadwinner. My mom lost her job when I was in undergrad. I didn't have access to a clinical provider. Me as the director at Cornell University, if I was to impose medical documentation, I would be forgetting where I come from on the west side of Chicago, when my mom and dad didn't have the means for me to have a clinical provider. You can't forget where we come from when we're doing this work and we're in isolation. I know it's not easy, but that's a tough live.
But, if I understood the question correctly, it was, how can you accommodate people without alienating others? And, maybe I have the wrong attitude, but I think that question is kind of problematic because it makes the assumption that if somebody else gets help, something's going to be taken away from the people who already have it. And that often is the subtext of people who are tend to be kind of hostile to of expanding opportunity. I mean, in my experience, in my 61 years in this world, I honestly can't really think of situations where people who were already represented, people who already had access, genuinely lost access. Now, I think what happens a lot of times is that people who are used to having everything, when they see somebody who traditionally hasn't gotten anything get something, that feels threatening to them. All this, they may not state it that way, but I think sometimes they say, gosh, I'm not quite who I used to be. My privilege isn't quite what it was because somebody like this, somebody who traditionally hasn't gotten things, all of a sudden is getting something. And I challenge anybody to say, how often are you genuinely losing something when somebody else who traditionally hasn't gotten it is able to get it? And so, maybe I completely misunderstood what that person asked, but just from my own experience, I mean, that question makes me a bit leery.
Thank you for those thoughts. Okay, well, I have one more question, I think, and then we will actually, I think I will not have one more question because I was going to pull from a list, but there is no more questions in the Zoom. So I'd actually like to open it up if any of the panelists have any kind of final comments, especially in light of our conversation. If you want to add kind of anything last thought that you've been pondering before I pass the floor to Dr. Mahoney, our system president. So I guess panelists, any last words?
I think I'll just say with intersectionality, the hardest thing is not wanting to be right, but trying to do what's right, right? So many times we want to be right. Let's focus on doing what's right. Even if I'm the one that's wrong, I'm okay, as long as we're doing the right thing.
Anyone else? It's okay if no one does. Actually, I can ask another question if no one does, but I wanted to offer the opportunity if you did have final comments before we move on, because I'm trying to watch the time. Okay, well, if there is no additional comments, I will pose one last question then, because we do have a little bit of time, and then I will pass it off. So We did mention actually a little bit about the Oppression Olympics. I mentioned it kind of in the introduction. And I was curious if you have any strategies for people on how to combat those moments that you might encounter, because I do think that there are moments that we might hear that in conversation, we might hear that in our workplaces. And I'm wondering if we could kind of let our audience know if we have any additional strategies on when we hear comments that are rooted in the Oppression Olympics.
I think allowing yourself to be vulnerable and speak up in those moments. None of DEI work or intersectionality and how different identities intersect is easy. None of it's comfortable. And so getting comfortable with being uncomfortable and being in those situations. I think personally, I've been in few experiences where I did not have a seat at the table, but somebody else opened up that seat for me. And it allowed me the space to make that table bigger for other people at the same time. As a woman of color, as a woman that speaks 2 languages, it opens up the door for me. And so a lot of the times it's almost like getting like those butterflies in your stomach that you're about to say something that you know is about to make people uncomfortable, say it anyways. Because making people uncomfortable also gets us to the point where we can recognize different things. We had, just as an example, last year, maybe the year before, we had some training and there was a professor that said that he didn't see color. And I was like, well, that's part of your privilege. And I know this professor personally, and I knew in that moment, this was probably not the best time for me to have said that, but I knew the 2 students of color in his program, 2. That was it, 2 students of color in this entire program, and I knew them. So if I know them and neither one of them are my students, you should definitely know them. And you should know that what it means that you have 2 Black students in your program. And so identifying those situations, I think, brings light to other people, and not everybody's going to listen. You have to be aware of that too. Not everybody wants to hear it, but it's more so about putting it out there, I guess, and making it known, because there's never, change is not done in the dark. It can't be. You need to see it, you need to feel it, you need to own it. So those are my 2 cents on that.
You know, when I kind of see things that are rooted in the Oppression Olympics, what kind of sometimes helps me reorient is, listen, like, we don't need to talk or get stuck in whose oppression is worse. Things are relative, people are coping the best they can, everybody has their own lived experience. But if we're going to oppose each other, we're really missing the chance we have to get together and actually oppose the thing that is affecting so many folks, right? So like if 2 oppressed people are fighting, they're doing it wrong. Got to get on the same side against what the true structure, policy, et cetera, is that's causing the oppression. And so sometimes a kind of moment where we reorient can be helpful, but it's hard because, oppressed folks often are very aggrieved in the fact that they're never seen and never heard and never valued. And you can get very self-righteous about that.
I'll start with saying that if we're operating from that scarcity mentality, we're uplifting the oppressor themselves, right? So the oppressor is sleeping at night comfortably as long as we're operating in this scarcity mentality. I would then say, on a very simplistic but complex level, we got to listen and show up, right? I think what happens is we stop listening because we get in that back and forth that Dr. Todd just talked about with who's oppressing is worse, which is still the same, probably individual, same policy, same procedure that's oppressing that entire group. I think when we start to talk about resources, that is a real conversation as we talk about dividing that up. But if I think about my resources individually, I think that's problematic. But if I think about my resources with Dr. Todd and with Alex and with Vivian and with Dr. Cheeseboro, and we all show up when we're supposed to, and not just when it's a Black issue, right? Not when it's just a woman's issue, right? Not when it's just an LG, but we all keep showing up with all of our resources all the time, then the oppressor then doesn't have the ability to sleep comfortably. And that's what we have to do. We have to listen, and we got to show up with our resources too, right? We can't show up empty-handed, like, oh, I'm just going to listen. Okay, what resource can I garner for them? And then when it's time for them to need resources from us, we don't give. We got to listen and show up with our resources.
Thank you all so much for that. I think that we have been able to exhaust the questions as well as some really wonderful responses. Thank you also, audience members, for your amazing comments in the chat as well. We appreciate your participation in that manner. So again, thank you, panelists, for being here, providing such insightful reflection for all of us. Thank you for the SIU system for actually providing this opportunity for us to actually have these types of conversations at a system-wide level, invite guests from other institutions. It's really been an honor to be a moderator here for this opportunity today. And so with that, I do want to turn it over to our SIU system president, Dr. Dan Mahoney, for closing remarks. So Dr. Mahoney.
Thank you, Lindy. And first of all, thank you to the panelists. This was incredibly interesting, thoughtful, insightful. Appreciate you sharing all of this with us tonight. And often when I wrap these up, I try to think about all that I heard, and I have like 4 or 5 pages of notes. So I will shorten it down so that we're not here till 8 o'clock at night. But really what I was starting to think about was this notion of multiple identities and our obsession, I think, in America with classifying people and putting them into boxes, and maybe even sometimes one box. And, you know, I thought back to, I was about 10 years ago, I was asked to be part of a research project that was interviewing administrators. And they asked me, the first question was really about whether my race influenced who I was as a leader. And I said, yes. And the person looked at me stunned, said, you're the first white person to admit that. And what I said was, part of it was I recognized there was a privilege with being white, and that had an impact on my entire career. And if I didn't recognize this to start with, then I was missing out on something pretty critical. And then when it goes beyond that, I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm cisgender, I'm Christian, I'm all of these things, all of which kind of compound that privilege in a way that is, you know, different than the multiple identities that we've been talking about a lot tonight, those that are discriminated against. I've had all of those privileges. And with that, and I would say too, our identities sometimes are things that other people may not even see. And so I'm Irish Catholic, I'm from New Jersey, I'm from a small town. All of those are wrapped up into my identity, and we don't know those. And we often try to determine for other people what identities should be most important to them, which is in and of itself wrong. But we do that, I think, a lot. And those identities change. I think Anthony's point, I never felt so American as when I was overseas. And all of a sudden, everybody started asking me, why do Americans feel this way? And why do, like, I was the expert on every American. And I was like, I don't even know half of the things they were asking me. But again, they felt that I was somehow not representative of an entire country, much like we do with people based on race or sexuality or whatever, that they know everything and they understand that. And again, that's something we do, I think, quite often. But what I also said in that interview is, part of it is I recognize as a leader, I constantly have blind spots. That because of all that privilege, I don't necessarily understand the experiences of others. Christine talked about having to check a box and how traumatic that was. I remember the first time someone explained that to me, who was very similar to Vivian. So had a father who was Latino and mother who was Black, and she hated that part of the experience. It never even occurred to me that that was something that someone would deal with. And again, I was in the data collection business in the university, so that hit me very hard, that we were putting people through this trauma on a regular basis. Vivian talking about, I have a family member who went through the IEP process. I'm just reflecting on how much easier that was for us because we spoke English and because we didn't have, again, some of those other issues, and we were in the school district we were, and all of the advantages that went with that. And I think Dr. Cheeseboro talking about, recognizing the issues that women deal with. And again, we all have these blind spots. Again, I probably have more than most, which means 2 things. One is I often think about this as I'm building leadership teams, is where are my blind spots and where can I help fill that in? But also taking advantage of every opportunity to listen, and try to figure out and try to find ways to close some of those blind spots. I liked a lot, Zebediah, you kept talking about the notion of utilizing your privilege. And that is something I also mentioned in that research project is I recognized my blind spots, I recognized that privilege. And I thought my role as a leader was to utilize that privilege, that I could say and do things because of that privilege that other people couldn't. And it was going to be accepted by other people in ways that it would not be accepted if it came from a Black male or a lesbian woman or whoever it was. I could do things and say things, and there was an opportunity that I had because of that privilege. I needed to take advantage of that. And I think for many of us, we probably have some aspect of privilege. I think you all hit on that at different times, that even if there's some areas of your identity where you're discriminated against, you also have areas where you're privileged. You talked about the Oppression Olympics. One of my favorite students at Winthrop was a Black lesbian with a disability, and she said she won the Oppression Olympics. But even she probably had areas where in certain settings, she had certain privilege that other people didn't, and where she could be supportive of them. And so I think that's what we try to do. We have that privilege, and that's I think what our obligation is. And I think the goal, and I think Zebediah said this as well, is to really have equity in access and opportunity. That's what our goal should be as higher education institutions, is what our goal should be as a society. And I was actually reflecting a lot on what Anthony said as well, that we often talk about that if some group gets something, we're losing something. And I always use the example of we view the world as if it's a pie. And if someone gets a bigger slice, in some ways, we've lost some. When actually the research shows that societies that are more open, more accepting of a diverse group of people, and there's lots of economics research on this, actually expand the pie and everybody wins. So I often talk about this focus that Zebediah brought up of, equity and access and opportunity is not just for those who traditionally been oppressed or discriminated against. We all actually benefit from a society that has that focus. So it's not just the right thing to do, it's really the smart thing to do as we move forward. And again, both as a society, but I also think about it a lot as a university system and what we can do. And again, that's part of our obligation, is to continually find ways that we can increase equity in both access and opportunity. So again, I thank you for everything that you've shared tonight. Wanted to remind you again to hit the red button to subscribe to our YouTube page. And if you again hit the notification bell icon, that it'll bring you back. Our next Conversation of Understanding in April is focused on one of my favorite topics, athletics and race. So I would invite you to join. That'll be our last one for this academic year, but then we'll pick it up again next year. So again, thank you to the panelists, and thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. Have a good evening.